What the Study Says.
Welcome back to What the Study Says. I'm Dr. Kai.
And I'm Dr. May.
Today, we're diving into something that's, well, pretty much everywhere. Artificial sweeteners.
Specifically aspartame.
Yeah.
It's in countless diet drinks, those sugar-free yogurts, even chewing gum.
It's everywhere. And it's sold as this easy way to cut down on sugar, cut calories. Sounds good on the surface.
But yeah, there's always been this question mark hanging over it, hasn't there? For years, people have worried.
That big question, does it cause cancer? You see these headlines popping up all the time, and honestly, they can be super confusing.
One day it's fine, the next day there's a panic. It's hard to keep track.
Absolutely. And it touches so many of our, daily choices. It's easy to get a bit lost.
So that's what we're doing today. We've gathered up a big stack of the science.
Yeah, we went way back, looked at the original stuff submitted for approval, the early animal tests.
To move through all the big human population studies over the decades.
And even dipped into some of the newer computational work, trying to get the full picture.
So our mission for you listening is to kind of guide you through all this.
We'll point out the key findings from these different types of research, try to make sense of why some studies might seem to disagree.
And hopefully help you piece together what the science overall is telling us about aspartame and cancer.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe how it even got approved.
Yeah, the regulatory side. Getting a food additive like this onto the market, especially in the U.S., it's a big deal.
It really is. The sources say when the company first applied to the FDA, they didn't just send a memo.
No, it was described as voluminous amounts of safety data, like tons of it.
And based on that, the FDA did give an initial nod back in 1974.
But only for certain things at first, right? Like sugar packets, gum, cold cereals.
Exactly, limited uses. But interestingly, that wasn't the end of the story.
No, that first decision, it got challenged pretty significantly.
Which kicked off this much deeper review process. It took, 6 years?
6 whole years. They were looking really closely at the concerns people had raised, including worries about brain tumors.
And that review was intense. The FDA went back and audited 3 key studies themselves.
And then an independent group, URP, they audited another 12 important studies.
And the crucial part, according to our sources, is that the results from all those studies were authenticated, they checked the data, it held up.
So after all that, digging through everything, the final FDA decision came in 1981.
And the conclusion then was that aspartame was safe for how it was intended to be used.
And that really set the stage globally, didn't it?
It seems so. The sources point out it's now approved in over 90 countries.
So, yeah, looking just at that regulatory journey, it was definitely not a quick rubber stamp. It faced serious challenges and got a very thorough look over.
Okay, so that's the approval story. But the science didn't just stop in 1981. Animal studies are, fundamental here.
Right, for figuring out toxicity, if something might cause cancer, standard practice.
Exactly. So when we look specifically at the animal studies focused on cancer, the ones in rats and mice designed to see if tumors pop up.
What did they generally find?
Well, the reviews we looked at show that the vast majority, 9 out of 12 mentioned in one review, were negative.
Meaning they didn't find an increase in tumors when the animals got aspartame.
Correct. No increased tumors. And these studies, they weren't just one type. Different species, male, female, different protocols.
And often at really high doses too, right?
Yeah.
Way more than a person would ever consume.
Absolutely. Mega doses sometimes.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets interesting and maybe a bit confusing.
There's always a but in science, it seems.
Well, there were some studies that reported different findings. Specifically, studies from the Ramazzini Institute, the RI studies.
Okay, what did they report?
They reported finding links to certain tumors, some unusual growths in the nose, cancers in the kidneys and related areas, and mammary gland cancers in rats.
So most studies say no link, but these few say yes. How do scientists deal with that kind of conflict?
That's such a crucial question. It really comes down to looking hard at the quality of the studies. How are they designed? How are they run?
And what did the expert reviews say about those RI studies?
According to the sources we read, the major scientific bodies that reviewed them found them to be non-reliable.
Non-reliable, why?
Because of what they called insurmountable study design limitations. Basically, problems with how the studies were done.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, things like they couldn't be sure about the health status of the animals to begin with. They used a kind of non-standard lifetime study design that isn't typical for this testing.
Okay.
And they didn't use standard criteria for diagnosing the tumors they reported, which makes the findings uncertain. Plus, they used historical control data from other different studies, which can introduce bias.
Right, so methodological issues that make it hard to trust the conclusions. That makes sense.
Exactly. It highlights that you can't just count studies for and against. You have to weigh the quality.
Good point. Was there anything else from animal studies? Like, does it promote tumors?
Yeah, good question. Separate studies looked at that, specifically tumor promotion, and those found aspartame was not a tumor promoter.
Okay, so beyond just counting tumors, what about how it might work in the body? The mechanism.
Right, understanding the how is key context. Scientists have ways to systematically check if a substance interacts with biological pathways known to be involved in cancer.
How do they do that?
Our sources talk about using a framework called the key characteristics of carcinogens, KCCs. Think of them as like the known footprints or signatures of things that cause cancer. Does the substance leave any of those footprints?
Okay, makes sense.
So they looked at aspartame across, get this, over 1,300 different biological endpoints related to these KCCs.
Wow. And the result?
A striking overall lack of activity. For almost all those key characteristics, aspartame just didn't seem to interact with the cancer-related pathways.
Almost all. Was there anything?
There was a little bit of activity noted for oxidative stress, but even then, the conclusion was that this activity was unlikely to be relevant for causing cancer at normal human exposure levels.
And did they look across different types of models? Like cells versus animals versus human data?
They did, and importantly, they found this overall lack of activity specifically held true when looking at human models.
That seems really important. And it connects back to something fundamental about aspartame, right? How our bodies handle it.
Exactly. This is probably one of the most crucial pieces. Aspartame doesn't just float around in your blood unchanged.
It gets broken down first.
Completely broken down, right in your gut, by enzymes, before it's even absorbed.
Into what?
Into basic building blocks. 2 common amino acids, phenylalanine and aspartic acid, which are in tons of foods you eat, plus a very small amount of methanol.
Which is also found in things like fruit juice, right?
Yep. And that methanol is also quickly metabolized. So the key takeaway is that the cells in your body are basically never exposed to intact aspartame.
They're exposed to these breakdown products.
Right. And often at levels that are pretty similar to what your body makes naturally or gets from other common foods anyway.
So that explains why maybe some lab studies that just put high doses of aspartame directly onto cells might not reflect what happens in a person.
Precisely. The body's metabolism changes the whole picture. It limits the relevance of some of those in vitro cell-based studies.
What about damaging DNA directly? Genotoxicity.
Yeah, the sources mention that too. The data there has been kind of mixed over the years, and some studies had reliability issues, so no strong signal there either when you look critically.
Okay, so that covers regulation, animals, mechanisms. Now, the big one. What about actual people? Human studies.
Yeah.
Epidemiology.
Right, looking at large groups of people, tracking what they eat and drink, and seeing what happens to their health over time.
There must be tons of studies on this by now.
Oh yeah, major reviews, meta-analyses where they combine results from multiple studies, including work done for the World Health Organization.
And what's the general vibe from those big reviews?
Overall, the consensus finding from many large studies is no apparent association between consuming artificial sweeteners, including aspartame, and the overall risk of getting cancer or dying from it.
No link overall. What about specific cancers people used to worry about, like bladder cancer?
Meta-analyses looking specifically at bladder cancer found no association. Interestingly, some studies even hinted at potentially lower odds for rarer cancers like ovarian or pancreatic with higher intake, but that's less certain, needs more research.
Okay, but human studies, as you said, they can be tricky. Do all studies agree?
Not always perfectly, and that's where nuance comes in. Human diet studies are incredibly complex. It's really hard to isolate one single ingredient.
Like that French study, Nutrient Santé, that made some waves.
Exactly. That large study did report an increased risk for overall cancer linked to higher artificial sweetener intake in their main analysis.
So there's a link then.
Well, here's the crucial detail often missed in headlines. The study also reported that when they compared the high artificial sweetener users to people who consumed high amounts of sugar, there was no significant difference in cancer risk between those two groups.
Oh, That changes the interpretation quite a bit.
It really does. It suggests maybe it's not the sweetener itself having a unique cancer-causing effect compared to sugar. It could be other factors related to why people choose sweeteners or their overall diet patterns.
Like maybe people drinking diet soda also have other habits or different overall diets.
Could be. Another big U.S. study, NHES, looked at aspartame intake and found no impact on overall cancer death rates.
So it comes back to those confounders you mentioned. Other things that muddy the waters.
Absolutely. Things like your overall diet quality, smoking, exercise levels, which sources note are way stronger cancer risk factors, even socioeconomic status. All these things can be tangled up with sweetener use and cancer risk, making it hard to pin down just one cause.
Makes sense. It's rarely simple with diet. Okay, one last area this source has touched on. Computational tools, like using computers to predict risk.
Yeah, this is a newer area. Using sophisticated computer models to predict how a molecule might interact with biological pathways at a molecular level.
What did they find for aspartame?
One study using these methods suggested aspartame has the potential to interact with some cancer-related proteins and might theoretically act through pathways similar to known carcinogens.
Potential. Theoretical. Sounds like there's a catch.
A big one. The study itself emphasizes this. These are molecular-level predictions. They absolutely need to be validated in real biological systems, living organisms, human studies.
Because a computer model isn't the same as a complex human body.
Not even close. So these computational tools are great for generating hypotheses, ideas to test further, but they aren't definitive proof on their own.
Got it. Okay, let's try and wrap this all up. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. So we saw the rigorous regulatory review process decades ago, based on animal data, concluded it was safe.
Then, most subsequent well-done animal studies also found no cancer link.
Mechanistic data shows a general lack of activity in cancer pathways, and crucially, it's broken down in the gut, limiting systemic exposure to aspartame itself.
And the human population data, while complex, overall doesn't show a clear link between aspartame use and overall cancer risk when you look at the whole body of evidence.
Right. So considering all these different lines of evidence together, the totality of it, as scientists say.
What's the bottom line from the sources we looked at?
The overall scientific consensus reflected in those major reviews and regulatory opinions worldwide continues to be that aspartame consumed within the established acceptable daily intake levels is not considered a carcinogen.
Hopefully, going through all these layers, regulatory, animal, mechanism, human, computational, gives you a clearer, more nuanced picture than just a quick headline ever could.
Yeah, it shows how science builds knowledge piece by piece.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on, maybe with a stick of sugar-free gum. Given how complex nutrition science is, with different studies and sometimes conflicting results, how do you personally decide which information to trust when making choices about what you eat and drink every day?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the science behind aspartame and cancer.
If you found this helpful, please do subscribe and share the channel with others who might find it useful.